After 8 years of loyal service on the city's police force, Rex, a highly trained German Shepherd K9, officially entered retirement. His career had been filled with impressive moments. He had tracked down fugitives, uncovered hidden evidence, and even once found a missing child in the woods during a snowstorm. But now, at 10 years old, with gray around his snout and a slight limp in his step, Rex had earned the right to rest. Officer Lauren Hayes had been his partner from the very beginning. Their bond wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. She trusted Rex with her life more times than she could count, and after his retirement, she didn't hesitate to adopt him. For her, he was more than just a working dog. He was family. Life after the police force took on a slower pace for both of them. Lauren had recently taken some time away from active duty to care for her aging mother, Ellen, who had moved into Willow Glen nursing home just outside the city. The facility had a calm atmosphere, pleasant gardens, and caring staff. It was the kind of place where residents could spend their later years in peace. Lauren visited regularly, sometimes daily, and she always brought Rex along. He became a familiar presence in the nursing home's halls. Residents smiled when they saw him approaching. Many of them reached out to pet him, their eyes lighting up with joy. Even the staff appreciated his calm and gentle nature. Some of the residents would even keep dog treats in their drawers, hoping for a visit. Rex adapted well to this new chapter. Though no longer chasing suspects, he remained alert and observant. He still paid close attention to his surroundings, responding to subtle shifts in mood or energy. Lauren had noticed it more than once. When a resident was anxious, Rex would quietly rest his head on their knee. When someone was ill, he seemed to sense it before anyone else. But one rainy Thursday afternoon, something different happened. Lauren and Rex entered Willow Glen just after lunch. She exchanged greetings with the staff and was on her way to her mother's room when Rex suddenly pulled to the right, away from their usual path. Lauren tightened the leash gently, thinking maybe he was just following a scent, but Rex insisted. He tugged again, this time more firmly, guiding her toward the east wing, a section of the building that hadn't been used in years. The hallway was quiet and dimly lit. Most of the rooms on this side were empty or used for storage. Rex's pace slowed as they neared an old janitor's closet near the end of the corridor. Then he stopped completely, ears up, nose to the floor. He sniffed along the base of the wall and began scratching at a small section just beside the closet door. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not aggressive, but deeply focused. Lauren blinked in surprise. She hadn't seen that look on his face in years. It was the same expression he used to wear when he was onto something, when he'd caught a scent or sensed something that didn't belong. "Rex," she said softly, kneeling beside him. He barked once, then resumed sniffing and pawing at the floor. His tail stood straight, his body stiff with concentration. He wasn't being playful or distracted. This was purposeful. At that moment, a nurse, passing through the hallway, paused. "He okay?" she asked, eyeing the dog curiously. "I think so," Lauren replied. "He's acting like he's found something." The nurse frowned. "That's strange. No one really goes down this way anymore. Just old storage rooms and unused space." Lauren stood up and examined the closet door. There didn't appear to be anything unusual, no smell, no sound, no sign of damage. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and Rex clearly sensed it too. After a few more moments, Rex finally sat down, still staring at the wall. Lauren gave him a pat and decided to take note of the exact spot. Something about his behavior stayed with her as she walked back down the hall. She'd learned long ago to trust Rex's instincts. He hadn't been wrong before. And deep down, she knew whatever was hidden behind that wall, it had just found its first witness. Lauren couldn't stop thinking about Rex's behavior that afternoon. Even after they returned home, he seemed restless. He paced the living room, sniffed around the doorways, and eventually lay near the front door, with his head resting on his paws, eyes alert. It reminded her of the old days when Rex was still in uniform, always one step ahead of trouble. The next morning, she returned to Willow Glen, but this time with a purpose. She brought along a folded copy of the building's layout she had requested months ago for safety reasons. As a police officer, she'd always liked knowing her surroundings. It didn't take her long to find the eastern wing on the blueprint, but something didn't match. She traced the hallway with her finger and stopped when she reached the janitor's closet. According to the layout, there should have been open space behind it, a room, or perhaps a storage unit. But on the blueprint, that area was marked as empty space, not walled off. Yet in reality, there was a solid wall. Frowning, Lauren folded the paper and tucked it back into her bag. She wasn't jumping to conclusions, but her gut told her this was more than just a dusty old corridor. And Rex had felt it to. Later that day, she took him back to Willow Glen, curious to see if he'd react the same way. The moment they stepped through the doors, Rex pulled ahead with intent. Without hesitation, he led her straight back to the east hallway. His pace quickened as they neared the same closet door. This time, he whined softly and scratched the floor in a rhythmic pattern like he was trying to dig. A maintenance worker named Tom happened to be nearby, changing light bulbs. He raised an eyebrow as he watched the scene unfold. Is he looking for something? Lauren glanced up at him. He used to be a K9 on the force. He's never behaved like this without a reason. Tom walked over, curious. I've worked here 8 years and barely even walked this hallway. Kind of forgotten, honestly. Does anyone ever go in here? Lauren asked, pointing to the closet. He shook his head. Not really. It's mostly unused supplies. Mop buckets, broken chairs. I can open it if you'd like. She nodded. Please. Tom unlocked the closet and pulled the door open with a creak. Inside, it was as dusty as expected. A few old shelves, some cleaning equipment, and the scent of aged wood. But nothing immediately unusual. Still, Rex didn't go inside. Instead, he focused again on the wall beside the door. Lauren stepped in and knocked gently on the wall. Then again, this time listening carefully. There was a slight echo. She paused and knocked on the other side solid. But here, behind Rex's focus point, there was definitely a different sound. You hear that? She asked. Tom nodded, eyes narrowed. That's not right. This wall's thinner than the rest. Rex barked once, then sat, staring up at them, as if waiting for their next move. Tom scratched his chin. I could bring a scanner in tomorrow, see what's behind it. That would be helpful, Lauren replied, her thoughts racing. She gave Rex a quick pat. Good boy, you still got it. That evening, she visited her mother, trying to set aside the strange discovery. Ellen smiled as always, happy to see both her daughter and the dog. But even as they chatted about daily things, Lauren's mind wandered back to the blueprint, the hollow wall, and Rex's insistent behavior. Before leaving, she approached the head nurse, Diana, a kind woman who had worked at Willow Glen for nearly 20 years. Diana, Lauren asked gently, do you know if there were ever any renovations done on the east wing? Diana's smile faded slightly. Not officially. That wing was part of the original building. Years ago, it was used for private care, but when management changed hands, it was mostly sealed off. Why, I think there may be a space that isn't listed anymore. Rex keeps reacting to the wall near the janitor's closet. Diana looked uneasy. That part of the building is rarely mentioned. Some of the old staff might remember more. Lauren nodded slowly. Would you mind if I asked around? Just be careful what you stir up, Diana said, almost under her breath. Some parts of the past were meant to stay quiet. Lauren left that night with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, Rex had sensed something real. And whatever it was, it had been hidden for a long, long time. Lauren barely slept that night. Her thoughts circled back to the strange hallway, the hollow wall, and Rex's unwavering behavior. Over the years, she had come to trust that dog's instincts more than most people's judgment. He had never once reacted to something that turned out to be nothing. That alone was enough to keep her attention locked on the east wing of Willow Glen. The next morning, she called in a favor from a friend at City Planning who had access to archived blueprints. Within hours, she had an older set of Willow Glen's building plans emailed to her, plans dated almost 2 decades earlier. What she saw made her eyebrows lift. The older blueprint clearly marked a room right where Rex had been focused. Not a storage closet, not an open area, but an actual patient room, room 113. But in the modern version of the layout, that room had disappeared completely. The space was marked as a solid wall. Lauren stared at the 2 plans side by side on her screen. One had a room, the other, a blank space. Somewhere along the line, room 113 had been sealed off and erased from record. She printed both copies and returned to Willow Glen with Rex by her side once again. As expected, the dog pulled her immediately to the same spot. He sniffed, circled, and scratched, just like before. This time, Tom, the maintenance worker, met her with a handheld scanner he had borrowed from a friend in construction. I figured this might come in handy, Tom said as he approached the wall. He powered on the device and began scanning the surface methodically. At first, the readout was normal. Then, A few feet in, the scanner beeped. He moved it again. Another beep. A rectangular shape began to form on the small screen, framing out what looked like a doorway inside the wall. Tom blinked. There's definitely something here. It looks like a sealed room. Lauren handed him the older blueprint. Room 113. It used to be here. He stared at the page. I've worked here for years. No one ever mentioned this. At that moment, Nurse Diana appeared behind them. Her face paled slightly when she saw what they were doing. You found it, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lauren turned to her. You knew. Diana hesitated. I didn't know it was still there. I assumed it had been torn down or repurposed long ago. That room, we stopped using it after something happened. What happened? Lauren asked. Diana looked conflicted. I think it's better if you talk to Martha. She was head nurse back then. She retired, but she lives nearby. I can call her. Later that afternoon, Lauren met Martha Douglas, a quiet, kind woman in her 70s. Her hands shook slightly as she poured tea and sat across from Lauren in her small home filled with houseplants and books. I remember room 113 very well, Martha began. We had a patient there named Margaret Elkins. Young woman, early 30s, quiet, polite. She had been brought in after a nervous breakdown, but she wasn't dangerous, just deeply withdrawn. Lauren listened carefully, letting the story unfold. Margaret's brother had passed suddenly, Martha continued. She had no one else. The doctors believed she needed long-term observation, and since we had an extra room, they let her stay. For a few years, she was stable. Didn't talk much, but she loved to paint and spent most of her time alone. Then, one day, she just stopped coming out. She refused meals. Wouldn't speak to anyone. What happened to her? Lauren asked. We tried everything. One morning, she was gone. No signs of escape. No explanation. The staff searched. Police were contacted, but nothing came of it. She was declared missing. Some believed she ran off. Others believed something else. Lauren felt a chill creep over her, and the room, after the investigation ended, the management sealed. It didn't want questions or rumors. Eventually, people forgot. New staff came. The old ones left. Lauren sat in silence. It was almost too strange to believe, but all the pieces were falling into place. Margaret hadn't been just forgotten. She had been hidden by time and silence, and Rex retired. Aging Rex had just opened the first door in 17 years. Lauren stood once again, in front of the wall where room 113 had once existed. Rex sat beside her, ears up, watching every movement as Tom prepared his tools. The old maintenance worker had called in another staff member for help, and the two were ready to carefully remove a section of the drywall. The head administrator had reluctantly approved Lauren's request after seeing the original blueprint and hearing Martha Douglas's story. He hadn't been thrilled about opening up a sealed part of the building. But Lauren's credentials and Rex's behavior were difficult to ignore. The hallway was quiet that morning, more so than usual. Staff members passed by with curious glances, but no one spoke. It felt like something heavy lingered in the air, as though the building itself knew that a secret was about to be uncovered. Tom began with a small cut near the corner of the wall. The drywall was older than expected, more brittle, and behind it was a layer of wooden paneling. As he peeled it back, dust poured out in small clouds, and the scent of aged air, stale and untouched, rose like a whisper from the past. Within 20 minutes, they had exposed a rectangular section large enough to reveal what lay behind it. What they saw stunned them all. There was, indeed, a hidden room, just as the blueprints had suggested, and it was almost perfectly preserved. Inside, dim light filtered through a cracked, shuttered window covered in layers of grime. A small bed with faded floral sheets sat in the corner. A wooden desk, still holding a stack of papers and an overturned mug, rested against the wall. There was a tall bookshelf, with several hardcovers, their titles faded. On the far side of the room stood an easel, a dried-up paintbrush resting on its edge. Lauren stepped inside carefully, the floor creaking softly under her boots. Rex followed but stayed near the door, as if sensing he was standing on sacred ground. The air was still, and the silence was thick. Everything had been left exactly as it was. It was clear no one had been in this space for a very, very long time. She picked up one of the books and blew off the dust. The Bell Jar, by Sylvia Plath. A notebook sat nearby, its cover aged and worn. She opened it, flipping through the pages slowly. They were filled with handwritten entries, simple sentences, some scattered thoughts, and sketches of faces and flowers. On one page, A single phrase had been repeated over and over again. I'm still here. Lauren felt a chill travel up her spine. Tom walked in behind her and exhaled sharply. It's like someone just left and never came back. No, Lauren said quietly. It's like someone stayed and no one ever came back for them. They continued searching the room, careful not to disturb too much. In the desk drawer, Lauren found several medical reports, Margaret Elkins's name, printed neatly at the top. The documents dated back over 15 years. There was also a staff log sheet, showing regular check-ins from nurses during her early stay. But the notes stopped abruptly after a few years. Then, nothing. No discharge, no transfer, no final record. It was like she had simply vanished from the system. Lauren stepped back out into the hallway, heart heavy. Diana had returned, watching the entire process with a mix of sorrow and shock. I never imagined, she whispered. We thought the stories were exaggerated, that it was just some old rumor from before our time. They sealed it and left her behind, Lauren said softly. Even if she left the room somehow, the fact that no one came back, no one checked, is heartbreaking. Rex leaned into Lauren's leg and let out a soft whine, his eyes fixed on the doorway. His instincts had led them here. His presence had uncovered a forgotten Patara story buried behind a wall. News traveled quickly through the nursing home. Some of the older residents, who had been there long enough to remember whispers of room 113, nodded in quiet recognition. Others were stunned that such a space had existed, hidden for so long just a few doors away from where they lived. Lauren knew this was only the beginning. The discovery of the room answered one question, but raised many more. Where had Margaret gone? And why had no one looked? The discovery of the sealed room spread like wildfire. Within days, the nursing home's board launched an internal review, and local reporters started asking questions. Lauren, though cautious, shared only what was necessary. She knew this wasn't just a sensational headline, it was someone's life. Someone who had lived in silence for far too long. Margaret Elkins had become more than a name in a file. She had once been a real woman with a voice, with pain, with hope. And now, the fragments of her world were slowly coming to light. Lauren spent hours going through the notebooks and sketchpads found in the room. Most of the pages were filled with rough drawings, flowers, trees, and faces, many of them unfinished. A few pages showed more vivid imagery, a window with iron bars, a single sunflower in a cracked vase, a clock with missing hands, symbols. She believed of how Margaret had experienced her time in isolation. But one particular drawing stood out. It was a sketch of the hallway outside the room, and at the end of it, drawn in fine pencil, was a woman standing beside a dog. The woman had no face, but the dog was clear, pointed ears, strong stance, and familiar eyes. It looked like Rex. Lauren stared at the drawing for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. Could it be that Margaret had once seen someone with a dog in that hallway? Or was it a wish? A hope that someday, someone would find her? The emotional weight of it pressed on Lauren's chest. She looked down at Rex, who now rested beside her on the living room rug, his tail wagging gently in his sleep. He had done more than most people would ever know. At Willow Glen, change was already underway. The wall had been left open temporarily, while authorities documented the scene, but now a glass panel covered the doorway. It was no longer a sealed secret, but a piece of history. Lauren returned to the nursing home again that week, to visit her mother, but also to meet with a local historian named Grace Lennox, who had taken an interest in the case. Grace had dug into old personnel records and found something remarkable. There's no record of Margaret ever being discharged, she told Lauren as they sat in the sunlit dining room. No family signed anything, no transfer request. It's like her case just disappeared. Lauren frowned. So there's no confirmation that she ever left? Grace shook her head. Not yet. But I did speak to a former orderly who remembered delivering meals to that hallway years ago. He said there were days when trays would go in, but never come back out. Lauren's brow furrowed. So someone may have still been living in that room long after the official visits stopped. That's the theory, Grace said. It's not proof yet, but it's enough to suggest that Margaret remained there longer than anyone admitted. Lauren exhaled slowly. And if she passed away inside that room? Grace nodded solemnly. Then someone hid it. Not out of cruelty, I think, but out of fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of what silence would reveal. That night, Lauren reread one of Margaret's final entries from the notebook. The writing was shaky, uneven, but clear. I think they've forgotten me. I hope someone remembers. I hope someone hears. 17 years. That's how long the room had been sealed. Hidden behind a wall, behind policies, behind the passing of time. No obituary, no memorial, just silence. Until Rex. Lauren didn't know if Margaret was still alive when the room was closed, but she did know one thing: she hadn't been completely alone. Her words remained. Her sketches spoke. And somehow, through the instinct of an aging dog and the persistence of a daughter visiting her mother, Margaret's story had found its way to the surface. Willow Glen was making plans to create a small remembrance wall, honoring Margaret and others who may have been forgotten through the years. It wouldn't change the past, but it would acknowledge it. It would bring light to a space that had long been in shadow. And Rex, retired, graying, and slower than he used to be, was no longer just a former canine. He was the one who listened when no one else did. A week after the hidden room was uncovered, Lauren sat at her kitchen table, sifting through a cardboard box filled with Margaret's belongings, cleared from the space before it was sealed off again for restoration. Everything inside had been carefully logged by the nursing home's legal team. But Lauren had asked for one last look before the items were archived. Among the stack of faded sketchbooks and hospital forms was an envelope, tucked deep inside, a drawer that had been jammed shut until maintenance finally pried it open. The envelope was thin, yellowed with age, and sealed with a single piece of brittle tape. On the front, in flowing handwriting, it read, "To whoever finds this, please remember me." Lauren paused, holding the envelope gently, before breaking the seal. Inside was a single photograph and a folded note. The photo was black and white, slightly out of focus, but powerful. It showed a young woman standing next to a man in a military uniform. They both looked happyish. She had her arm linked through his, and he stood tall, smiling. On the back of the photo, in small writing, were the words, "Me and Daniel." Before everything changed, the name Daniel Elkins matched the one on Margaret's admission documents, her brother, listed as her only known relative. Lauren felt a sudden ache in her chest. This was more than a case. More than a forgotten room. This was about someone who had once laughed, loved, and lost. She unfolded the note next. The handwriting was shakier, uneven. It read, "If someone finds this, thank you. I was not ready to leave, but no one asked me if I wanted to disappear. I don't know if I'm real anymore. But I remember love. I remember Daniel. And I remember the sound of birds outside this window. Please, don't let them forget me." Lauren read it twice, then a third time. There was no anger in the words, no bitterness, only a quiet sorrow and a soft, pleading hope. With her heart heavy, she drove back to Willow Glen and met with Grace Lennox, the local historian who had taken it upon herself to dig into Margaret's background. They sat together in the small on-site library as Grace pulled up an old article from a local paper dated 17 years earlier. It featured a photo of Daniel Elkins, Margaret's brother. The article was a short piece honoring his service overseas. He had passed away during active duty. According to the accompanying information, Margaret had been admitted to Willow Glen just weeks after the funeral. She never recovered from losing him. Grace said quietly, he was all she had left. No other family, no close friends. Her world just stopped. Lauren looked down at the photo again. The way Margaret clung to her brother in the picture, it wasn't just affection. It was everything. Daniel had been her anchor. That room was the only part of the world she felt safe in, Lauren said. And when it got sealed, she didn't just lose her space. She lost her voice. Later that afternoon, Willow Glen's board approved a small but meaningful gesture. They would turn room 113 into a tribute space, keeping the glass panel intact, placing some of Margaret's artwork inside, and adding a simple plaque outside the door that read, "In memory of Margaret Elkins. May her story never be silenced again." It wouldn't erase the past, but it was a step toward restoring dignity, toward giving back a name that had once been hidden behind drywall and forgotten documents. That evening, Lauren sat with Rex on their porch. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. He rested his head on her foot, eyes closed, breathing slow. She reached down and stroked the fur behind his ears. "You did more than anyone else could, boy," she whispered. "You listened. You found her." He gave a soft sigh, and for a moment, Lauren thought he smiled in his own quiet way. She looked out at the fading sky, the photo still in her hand. Somewhere, she hoped, Margaret knew that someone had remembered, that someone had heard her. And, all because one old canine refused to stop doing what he was born to do: protect, uncover, and never ignore a silent voice. By the end of the month, Margaret Elkins's name was no longer a forgotten file in a drawer. Thanks to Lauren, Rex, and the quiet determination of a few key people, her story had reached the light of day. But even with the room uncovered and her personal items documented, one central mystery remained unsolved. What had actually happened to Margaret? There was no official record of her being discharged, no documentation of her leaving the building, and most haunting of all, no death certificate. She had simply vanished from the paper trail. Lauren couldn't let it go. She began revisiting the people who had worked at Willow Glen during the early 2000s. Some were now retired, others had moved away, and a few, like Martha Douglas, were still in the area. Martha had helped as much as she could, but there was a limit to what memory could recall. After nearly 2 decades. Then, Grace Lennox received a lead. "I found someone," Grace said one morning, calling Lauren with urgency. A former night nurse named Eleanor Reed. She worked at Willow Glen for almost 10 years. She was on duty the night Margaret was last confirmed present. "I tracked her down in a small town 2 hours from here. She's willing to talk." By the afternoon, Lauren and Grace were driving toward Eleanor's cottage, tucked in a quiet rural area lined with pine trees. The woman who greeted them was in her late 60s, with careful eyes and a nervous energy. She invited them into a modest living room and poured tea before sitting across from them. "I always knew someone would come asking," Eleanor said, voice calm but tired. "It's been on my heart for years." Lauren leaned forward. Do you remember Margaret?" Eleanor nodded immediately. "How could I not? She was quiet, always painting, never caused a fuss, but I could tell she was carrying something heavy inside." She looked down, as if weighing every word. "The truth is, we didn't handle it right. One night I went to check on her and found her still. She was lying on her bed, facing the window. I called the doctor on duty, but instead of calling the coroner or filing a report, he told us to keep it quiet." Lauren's eyes widened. "Keep it quiet? Why?" There had been pressure from above. A recent audit, concerns about patient care, losing a long-term patient without family. It would raise questions. He said it would be better to close the room and avoid the attention. We were told to document it in the internal logs only. And then, somehow, even those logs were scrubbed. Grace looked shocked, and no one ever checked. People changed jobs. The administrator who made the decision retired a year later. After that, the story just faded. Eleanor's voice wavered. "I've lived with that guilt. I didn't speak up. I should have. But I was scared." Lauren didn't speak for a moment. She simply nodded, absorbing the weight of Eleanor's confession. It was the final piece they needed. Margaret hadn't disappeared. She had passed quietly, in that room, and her memory had been buried by the silence of others. Back at Willow Glen, the administration acted quickly. With Eleanor's testimony and the documentation Lauren and Grace had collected, they filed an official report to the State Health Board. Margaret's death was formally registered. She was no longer missing. She was no longer erased. The nursing home hosted a small but heartfelt ceremony in the garden, beneath the old willow tree that gave the home its name. Residents, staff, and even a few former employees gathered. A framed print of Margaret's artwork was placed on a stand, surrounded by wildflowers. Lauren spoke briefly, telling Margaret's story not as a tragedy, but as a reminder that no one deserves to be forgotten. Rex sat quietly beside her the whole time, eyes calm, tail still. Though older now, with slower steps and tired bones, he remained sharp, dignified, and proud. As the sun dipped low, the crowd stood for a moment of silence. Birds chirped in the distance, and a soft breeze moved through the leaves overhead. For the first time in 17 years, Margaret Elkins was seen, named, and honored. And all of it had started with the instincts of a dog who couldn't ignore a quiet space and a voice that had waited far too long to be heard. Summer came to Willow Glen with soft winds and blooming lilacs. The nursing home had never felt more alive. A few months had passed since the discovery of Margaret's hidden room. And in that time, the facility had gone through noticeable changes. Not just structural, but emotional. People talked more, listened more. Residents were encouraged to share their stories, their memories, their fears, and through it all, the story of Margaret Elkins quietly echoed in the halls, not as a dark secret, but as a reminder of how easy it is to let someone fade away. The tribute space that had once been room 113 was now complete. A clear glass wall separated it from the hallway, but nothing inside had been altered. The easel still stood in the corner. The bed remained neatly made, A few of Margaret's sketches had been framed and placed nearby, and a single sunflower sat in a vase by the window, freshly replaced each week by one of the residents who had volunteered to take care of it, above the door. A bronze plaque read, "In memory of Margaret Elkins, 1971 to 2006. She was here. She mattered." Lauren stood in front of the tribute, one quiet afternoon, Rex sitting at her side. His breathing was heavier these days, and he moved more slowly, but his eyes remained sharp. He had brought them here. He had been the one to sense what others had ignored for years. "You really never gave up, did you?" Lauren whispered, running her hand along his fur. He looked up at her and gave a soft whine, as if answering Dot. She had taken a short leave from the police department after everything that happened, not out of burnout, but to reflect, to think about how often people are left behind in the shuffle of paperwork and process. She realized that uncovering Margaret's truth had changed her not as an officer, but as a person. That week, the local community center hosted a memorial event called Voices Remembered, dedicated to individuals who had been forgotten in care facilities, hospitals, or institutions. Margaret's story was the centerpiece. Lauren was invited to speak, and she brought Rex with her, Dot, as she stood at the podium. Facing a room of families, caregivers, and advocates, she held up a copy of the faded photo of Margaret and her brother, Daniel. "This is not just a story about loss," Lauren began. "It's a story about silence and what it costs." Margaret didn't ask for the world to remember her. She simply asked not to be erased. And it took a retired K9, long past his days of duty, to uncover what had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. The room was silent, eyes fixed on her. We all move quickly these days. But sometimes, we need to pause and look at the people who sit quietly in the corners of our lives. Because behind every quiet door, behind every forgotten hallway, there may be someone hoping to be seen. Rex received a standing ovation when Lauren called him to her side. He stood proudly, tail wagging gently, unaware of the full weight of what he had accomplished, but feeling, in his own way, that he had done something good. Back at Willow Glen, residents began leaving small notes on a bulletin board near Margaret's room. Some were simple. "Thank you for reminding us to listen." Others were longer, handwritten letters from people who had known Margaret years ago, but thought she had moved away. Margaret Elkins had waited 17 years in silence. But now, her name was on everyone's lips. Her artwork was displayed not just in the nursing home, but in the local library and city hall. Students wrote essays about her. A local artist even created a mural inspired by her sketches. As for Rex, his journey had come full circle, from a decorated K9 to a beloved companion, and finally, to a quiet hero who found one more mission before his time was done. Lauren often said, most officers retire, but some, like Rex, just pause until the world needs them again. And, in the forgotten space behind a dusty wall, in the quiet heart of a nursing home, the world had needed him. And he answered,